edge of the woods, he came to a big tree. Now, it was bigger than that tree. It was a really big tree. And so the woodsman walked up to the tree and he knocked. Imagine that. He knocked on a tree. But imagine this. A door opened in the tree and out came a gypsy. Now, she was dressed in brightly colored gypsy clothes. She had a long dress. She had a scarf on her head that had lots of bright colors and big gold hoop earrings. And the gypsy said, "Ah, woodsman, so good to see you." And the woodsman said, "Well, thank you, ma'am." "I like you," said the gypsy, "because when the other people would make fun of me, you would always smile." And the woodsman said, "Well, all I ask in return is a smile back." And the gypsy said, "One moment." And she went into the tree and she came out with nothing. Or was it nothing? "Here, take this cloak of invisibility. It will hide you from men's greed and protect you from their envy." Now, do you know what invisibility means? Do you know? No? Invisibility means that you can't see anybody. So it was a cloak of invisibility because you couldn't see it. But when you put it over you, you became invisible and nobody could see you. So the woodsman took his cloak of invisibility and he started for the castle. And he got to the town and he saw the big castle and he crossed the moat and he went in and he found the king's chambers. And he opened the big doors and he went into the king's chambers, and the first person he saw was dressed in really funny clothes. And he had a hat on with bells on the end. And who do you think it was? It was the king's jester. Now, it's the king's jester job to make the king laugh. And so he would dance and do funny tricks. In fact, he might even juggle. And if you're here at 3 o'clock, you're going to see a really good juggler. Okay? So, the next person the woodsman saw was dressed in big velvet robes. He had a big purple hat on with a long feather in it, and that was the king's prime minister. And he had a scroll under his arms, and it was his job to enforce all the king's rules and to make sure that everything was orderly in the kingdom. And the next person the woodsman saw was dressed all in black. And he even had a black hood over his head with 2 little slits for his eyes to look out. And next to him, he had the biggest axe the woodsman had ever seen. And that was the king's executioner. And it was his job to cut off people's heads. And the next person he saw in the throne room was sitting on the big throne. And he had a big crown on his head and big robes on, and it was the king. And the king looked out and saw the woodsman coming, and he said, "Ah, who are you? Wait, don't tell me. I bet you are a prince in disguise." And the woodsman said, "No, your majesty, I'm just a humble woodsman come to try and marry your daughter." And the king said, "Prime Minister, read him the rules." And so the prime minister opened his big scroll and he started reading. Hear ye, ladies and gentlemen of the kingdom. Whoever shall find out how my daughter, the princess, wears holes in her slippers every night, shall get to marry my daughter and have half the kingdom." And the king said, Go on. "But whosoever shall try and fail shall have his head cut off." And he rolled up the scroll. And the king said, "Well, woodsman, good luck. You must be used to the axe. Don't lose your head." And so the woodsman left the king's throne room and went out, and he went up a lot of steps to a long tower, a very high tower. And at the top of the tower was the princess's bedroom. And so the woodsman sat down in front of the bedroom and he waited. And he waited. And pretty soon the door opened and out came the princess. And she was so beautiful, he fell in love right away. And she said, "Oh, you look like you're cold out here. Let me get you some hot chocolate." And she went back in her bedroom and she brought out a cup of hot chocolate for the woodsman to drink. Now the woodsman thought, there might be something in that chocolate, so I'm not going to drink it. He only pretended to drink it. And after a while he said, "Well, thank you very much. And the princess took the hot chocolate and went back in her bedroom. And then the woodsman began to pretend to sleep. And after a while, the princess opened the bedroom door. She saw the sleeping woodsman, and she tiptoed down the hall. Well, as soon as she had gotten past the woodsman, he got up and put on his cloak of invisibility, so now nobody could see him. And he tiptoed down the hall after the princess. And she got to the end of the hall, she opened a door and went down all the steps, and the woodsman was right behind her. And then they went into the throne room, and right behind the princess's throne was a secret door. And she opened that secret door, and she went in, and the woodsman quickly followed her, and they went down some steps, and it went right to the stable where the princess's carriage was waiting. And she got into the carriage, and just in time, the woodsman jumped on the back as the carriage went out across the drawbridge and into the city, and it went down the road and over the river and through the woods and up and down and all over, and finally it got to the middle of the forest, and it stopped. And the princess got out. And the woodsman listened, and he could hear music and dancing and laughing. There was a big gypsy camp in the middle of the woods, and they were having a party. And the princess got out, and she started dancing with everybody, and it was a great time. And the woodsman was watching, and he thought, well, I want to go to the party too. So he took off his cloak of invisibility, and he put on a little mask across his face so people wouldn't know who he was. And he waited his turn, and finally it was the woodsman's turn to dance with the princess. And they started dancing and dancing, and all of a sudden, the rooster crowed. And the princess stopped dancing, and she ran back to her carriage. And quickly the woodsman put on his cloak of invisibility, and he ran to the carriage, and he hung on for dear life as they went over the hills and over the river and down the woods and through and back across the moat and into the castle, into the carriage room, into the stable. And the princess ran up to her bedroom. But the woodsman went back to the king's chambers. And the king saw him coming in, and he said, you have tried and failed again. Another one, off with his head. But your majesty, said the woodsman, I know how your daughter wears holes in her slippers every night. And the king said, you do? Well, I don't like cutting off people's heads, but that's what the rule was. How does she do it? And the woodsman said, she dances at a gypsy camp in the middle of the woods. What? I never heard of such a thing. And just then the princess walked into the room. And the king said, daughter, is it true that you spend your nights dancing in the middle of the woods at a gypsy camp? And the daughter said, yes, father, it is true. The king said, well, then it shall be. Woodsman, you shall marry my daughter and have half my kingdom. And the princess said, father, no, I cannot marry this man, because last night I danced with the love of my dreams, and I couldn't be happy with anyone else. And just then the woodsman reached in his pocket. He took off the mask that he had worn. He went up to the princess, and they started to dance. And they danced, and they danced, and then they lived happily ever after. Well, another member of the Bluff Country Tale Spinners is going to join us now for a story.